Hey guys, Dr. James here again. Now we're talking about nutrient timing and food composition pairing strategies. So we're kind of getting into that nitty gritty of like what you actually eat and when. So what I wanted to do is just run through some really common examples of some typical timelines and what example foods we might expect to eat during those times. Now, I want to just preface this by saying these are just examples. Please don't take this as gospel. And you certainly don't want to eat what I eat. Like my food is terrible. No one should eat what I eat. But, anyways, I'm just trying to make some recommendations for you guys. And so, by all means, you can adjust these to your personal preference. But I'm just trying to kind of highlight what some sample meals at different times throughout the day might look like. So, please don't take this to mean like these are the only things that you should eat at these times. They're just examples. So you can, of course, use your judgment and personal preferences to meet these things as well. So, what I wanted to look at are kind of our pre workout meals, our intra training meals, our post workout meals, and maybe a couple different contexts. And then some other like non training related meals and what they might look like for a typical athlete who is thinking about recovery strategies a little bit more. So, why don't we start with our pre training meals? So, the goal of our pre training meal is to provide energy for the upcoming training session without causing a lot of gastrointestinal distress. I'm sure most of you who are athletes or coaches have gone to a training session and you maybe yourself or your athletes start warming up and then all of a sudden they're taking trips to the bathroom, or maybe they paint the wall another color. That was a vomit joke. I went there. We're going there. It's fine. Right? We've all been there. It's happened. So what we want to do is try and figure out like what are the kind of foods we can eat and when that will support us in training, but also not require us to, having to go to the bathroom, not to have like a bunch of gas or sloshing in the stomach, or, worst case scenario is you end up vomiting or something like that. That's not great. So this is, it sounds silly, but it is important. So it's worth talking about. So let's look at some pre-training meals. The first kind of timeline I want to highlight is if your athlete or yourself is having a pre-training meal kind of somewhere like 30 minutes or less before a training session. So, as you can guess, this can be kind of rough if you're eating a lot of solid food this close to a training session. So, typically, if we're looking at 30 minutes or less before training, we're probably going to choose liquid sources just because those are going to rapidly digest and they're not going to be just hanging out in our GI tracts for a long time. So, for these meals, we're probably going to avoid fat and fiber as much as possible, as close to zero as we can get. And we're probably going to opt for some like liquid sources of carbohydrates and or proteins. So a really good example of this is just taking your favorite sports drink or juice as carbohydrate sources, and then something like a whey protein shake. Both of those things will digest super, super rapidly. They'll sit well in the stomach, generally won't cause a lot of GI distress. You might, the fluid intake might make you have to go pee at some point, but that's not a big deal. And you won't have this like big bolus of solid food sitting in there. And then when you start warming up, 40 minutes from then, start to feel yucky. So generally, again, in that 30 minutes or less, probably going to opt for liquid sources, as little fat and fiber as possible. And then we're looking for rapidly digesting sources, things like whey protein or high glycemic carbohydrates like sports drinks, fruit drinks, something along those lines. That's a pretty solid for that particular timeline. Next, we're looking at pre-training meals, we'll say like 1 to 2 hours before a training session. Now, here, we don't necessarily want to have liquids anymore because we have plenty of time for that solid food to digest. So we might kind of pivot more towards whole food sources or just solid foods in general. They can still use liquids if they want. Again, that's more of a personal preference, but I would generally just push people towards, whole food sources, solid foods as much as possible. And we just want to have things that we know that will sit well within their stomach, right? Now, you can opt for a little bit more slower digesting food options if you want, especially if you're a little bit more sensitive, or you can kind of hit that middle ground of, moderate digesting food sources. So we're going to pick some solid things. We're probably going to keep fiber and fats low. It doesn't have to be zero like in the other instance, but we're going to keep these on the relatively lower side, not zero, but just low. And then we're probably going to choose some just go-to foods that we know aren't going to upset our stomachs, right? So a really simple example might be just like a sandwich with some lean meats and some veggies, or something like a chicken and rice bowl, something that, pretty easy going on the stomach. It's not going to be so much food that we're going to be bloated and gassy and all those things, but something that will go down relatively easy. You can, if you want to make it a little bit more slower digesting, you might choose things like whole grain or whole wheat bread or brown rice. But within the 1 to 2 hours, I think kind of that middle of the road digestion timeline is good. So it's a perfectly fine if you want to have like white rice, white breads, things along those lines. It doesn't have to be like the most health promoting, most fibrous, most complex carbs. Any of those would be fine. And again, there's some personal preference here. Like some people will be a little more sensitive to some foods than others. Totally fine. But again, keeping fiber and fats relatively low, switching to whole foods rather than liquids, and then kind of more on that moderate digestion timeline. And then we move into pre-training meals where we're looking at like 2 hours plus, more than 2 hours before training. Here, this is where having a little bit more slow digesting sources can actually be helpful, just because 2 hours or more before a training session, that's starting to, become a notable amount of time, and you want the energy from that meal to still sustain you throughout the training, right? So we're talking like maybe you eat 3 hours before training, but you still might have like a 90-minute training session at that point. So you want whatever you ate to still be filling and still sustain you over that time, right? So we're going to probably opt for solid food choices. We're probably not going to choose any liquids in this one because the liquids will just digest too rapidly, and then you'll find yourself starving and maybe low energy. Here, you might actually just grab whatever your go-to protein source is. You might not, you know, do anything particularly fancy. You might just grab whatever you normally would go for protein, whether it's like a chicken or a beef or, whatever your go-to source is. And then you might opt for some slower digesting carbohydrate options like your fruits and veg, maybe some like whole grains, whole wheats, something along those lines. And then you might pair it with some monounsaturated fat sources like some olive oil or some almonds or peanuts to kind of slow things down a little bit. So this starts to kind of look like more of like a normal kind of health promoting kind of non-training meal at this point, because we're starting to see a little bit more fiber, a little bit more fat, just health promoting type foods. And again, the athlete can play around with this, but the idea being we want to slow that digestion timeline down a little bit so that even though we ate 2, 3 hours before, it's still sustaining us throughout whatever training session that we're having. The trouble that you get into is the more filling that meal is in terms of like how much fiber and fat and how big the meal is, how much food, the more likely it's going to cause GI distress. So there's a little kind of trial and error with some of these bigger, pre-workout meals in that 2 hour plus timeline that you kind of have to trial and error. But again, let's get to the solid foods, your go-to protein sources, normal protein sources, and then kind of maybe pick some of the more complex carbohydrates, a little more high fiber content, maybe add some fats, some peanuts, some almonds, anything monounsaturated is probably a pretty good plan. Okay, so that covers our pre-training meals for the most part. Let's move into the intra-training meals. So for the intra-training meals, it's very much going to be like our first option on the pre-training meals that was 30 minutes or less. For the intra-training, we generally don't want to have any solid foods. And if you've done this before, maybe on accident, you probably know why, because it's pretty awful. But also, we just want things that are going to be digesting really, really rapidly. So we're going to choose things that are pretty easy to put down. Now, sports drinks tend to come to mind first, like whether it's a Gatorade or a Powerade or something along those lines. Those tend to work out really, really well. They have electrolytes, they have really, really high glycemic carbs, and they go down really, really easy for most people. In terms of protein, this is kind of hit or miss depending on how you want to set up your meal schedule. Intra-workout protein is not really necessary for a lot of athletes and maybe not necessary at all. There's not like a huge timing benefit outside of just making sure you're getting that even protein distribution. So if you want to incorporate a protein source, again, like a whey protein, whether it's a concentrate or an isolate, doesn't really matter. Just like a whey protein shake is a pretty good option. And then things like our sports drinks tend to work really, really well for carbohydrates. Again, we want these to generally be liquids, and the protein is kind of optional depending on how you wanted to set it up. But if we're going to do intra-training carbohydrate, probably want that to be nice and glycemic, liquid source, no fats, no fiber, just goes down nice and easy. Okay, let's move into the post-training meals. This is where things get a little bit more complicated because it's kind of sounds yucky to say out loud, but there's just a kind of different levels of athletes and different demands, right? So it's perfectly fine for a recreational athlete who trains, 5 times per week to do X, Y, and Z with their nutrition. But that's just going to be very different for kind of I'm going to use this term loosely, but are more professional athletes. So let's just say, people who are at like collegiate athletics, people who are semi-pro, pro, or maybe working their way towards like a national or a world team, people along those lines who are, just have higher sporting aspirations. If you've ever worked with a college team, it's not unusual for them to train, to have like 10 to 18 or more training sessions per week. Whereas like a recreational athlete might train, maybe 3 or 4 times per week. And there's a big difference there. And you might be wondering, like, what are you blathering on about, James? Well, the reason being is that the level of athlete and the number of training sessions that you're doing per day or per week actually kind of influences how you might approach a lot of your post-training meals. The big reason being is that when you train multiple times per day or per week, the limiting step to your performance in the subsequent training sessions after the first one is going to be how quickly you can resynthesize glycogen and have available energy for training. That is an immediate impediment and roadblock to all subsequent training sessions, right? So you can imagine your first training session of the week, you train really hard, you got to put a lot of the carbohydrates back in that you've expended, right? And your ability to do so will depend on the foods you eat, how much you eat, the glycemic index of the carbs, the timing, etc. Right? And so in this case, when we have people who are training maybe 2, 3 times per day, the rate limiting step to their performance is how quickly they can get carbohydrates back into their systems. Whereas somebody who just trains, again, I mean this respectfully, if they train like 5 times per week, that's just not as much of a limiting factor. In fact, they can probably eat like just normal foods and do just fine. Like the difference between doing a nutrient timing and food composition paired strategy for that athlete versus just kind of eating more normally is probably inconsequential. And that it's not meant to sound demeaning or insulting, but there's just a difference between like people who are training really, really hard and really, really rigorously versus people who are training more recreationally. That's my only point, right? So again, the reason I'm bringing that up is because we might choose how we structure our post-workout meals a little bit differently based on that. So for our more recreational athletes, we might not choose some of these a little bit more, nutrient timing, uh, uh, food pairing specific strategies. We might just go ahead and say, just eat a good, normal, healthy meal. So let's start with a little bit more complicated one first. Let's deal with our athletes who are training very, very frequently. We're talking, multiple times per day, multiple times per week, kind of beyond the normal, typical 3 to 5 training sessions per week. We're talking about people who are training maybe like 10 to 24 times per week between their sport training, their conditioning, their weight training, etc. Right? So for those athletes, when they have their post-workout meal, generally we want these to be as rapidly digesting as we can because the limiting step to performance in the subsequent training session will be how much carbohydrate we got back into their system and is readily available for training again. So we want these meals in the post-workout window to be rapidly digesting as much as possible. Now, in this case, you can use a combination of solid or liquid. You can go all liquid, you can go all solid, or you can use a combination of them, so long as they're going to be rapidly digesting sources. Again, this is a situation where we want that fiber, and that fat to be as close to zero as we can. There's some reasonable limits there, but we want it to be as close to zero as we can get. And we want those carbohydrate sources to be high glycemic, and we want those protein sources to be easily digestible. So, what are some examples of meals like this? Well, one that I have recommended for years and years and years, and people love it, whether you're an athlete or a coach or whatever, get ready, is sugary kids cereal and then using something like skim milk or whey protein as the liquid, right? This is something that like you can put down a lot of carbohydrates really, really fast, and it's delicious. And it's kind of a fun one too, right? Because no one is ever disappointed to have like a really nice, like sweet treat after some hard training, right? It feels good. You get in there, you train really hard, and then you have this like delicious treat waiting for you at the end. Not only is it fun and something to look forward to, but it actually meets the demands of this strategy, which is we want rapid protein, rapid carbohydrates, and we want to get a lot in a short amount of time. And so you can, if you're using something like a Frosted Flakes or a Fruity Pebbles, like you can put down quite a bit of carbohydrates without actually feeling full, without feeling distended and gross, right? You can get a lot in. So this is kind of a fun one for your athletes because they will tend to enjoy that a lot, and it actually serves this demand very, very well. So any of your kind of like sugary kids cereal and then something like a skim milk where there's no fat, no fiber will work really, really well. And it's, again, something that people generally will start to look forward to. I know it sounds like, oh, that sounds like junk food, but again, we're training for recovery here, not necessarily health promotion. And this is a way of really getting in that high glycemic carbohydrates in fast so that they'll be ready to go for that next training session, right? Now, what do you do with that athlete throughout the rest of the day? Well, it's probably a good idea to start tapering down the rapidness of the meals that you're choosing and maybe kind of inching closer towards more of the health promoting meals. So your first meal post exercise might be really glycemic, really, really fast digesting, excuse me. And then the subsequent meals, you might start ramping up, how much complex carbohydrates, how much fats you have, and you start getting away from that like kind of junk food scene, right? But the first meal might be like, again, very kind of, I don't want to say junk food pedantically, but yeah, it might be more, a little bit more on the junk food side of things. And then moving into the more kind of like healthy meals throughout the rest of the day. Now, if you're dealing with somebody who is more of our kind of recreational athlete, do you need to go and slam hundreds of grams of sugary, high glycemic carbs post exercise? No, you can probably move into kind of more typical, I would say just like health promoting style meals, like your normal go to protein sources, some complex carbohydrates, a little bit of fats, etc. Probably do just fine. It's not because they're doing anything wrong. It's just because the need for them to resynthesize glycogen will just naturally and organically happen over time as they eat more and more meals throughout the day. Whereas our, high frequency training athletes, they just don't have that time in between training sessions. So they need to get in as much as they can, as rapidly as they can between training sessions. So, if we're dealing with our more recreational athletes in the post workout meals, they can be kind of a combination of either high glycemic or low glycemic carbohydrates, probably all solids at this point, just your go-to protein sources. You can still keep fats relatively low, but it doesn't have to be like zero. You can keep fiber low if you want. This is a little bit of on that personal preference. Like if you want it to be more glycemic, that's fine. If you want it to be less glycemic, that's probably fine too. Not a huge plus either way. It's really for our athletes who are training really, really frequently where this tends to make a more tangible difference. Okay, so after we've kind of dealt with that post workout meal, we move into kind of our non-training meals. And so this will apply to our, rigorously training athletes and our recreational training athletes alike. Generally, once we get into our non-training meals, so they're not in that immediate pre-post period, we're going to start to switch to our health promoting foods, such as just like our lean meats, our monounsaturated fats, our complex carbohydrates, meaning our fruits and veg, our whole grains, whole wheats, plenty of fiber, etc. We don't necessarily have to try and artificially keep the glycemic index low. In fact, we want to promote health and like eat relatively, good healthy food sources that will keep you fuller longer. So for the most part, once we move out of our post-workout window, we're going to switch to just like our kind of standard health promoting foods, which again is going to be like our lean protein sources, complex carbohydrates, monounsaturated fats, etc. And these meals will be a little bit more filling. We're going to probably be a little bit higher in fat, maybe a little bit lower in carbohydrates in general, but these will still be like very satisfying, very sating meals. So getting away from the rapid digestion, just moving into kind of like slower digesting, health promoting foods. And then last but not least, a lot of athletes don't necessarily think about this one. It's actually probably a good idea to have something to eat, like a meal or just, even if it's just like a snack, about 1 hour or so before bedtime. Now, this can be variable with personal preference because some people have a hard time eating late at night. But what we want to ensure, again, is that nice sustained protein feeding throughout the evening and the fasting period. So, what we would want here is a slower digesting protein source, plenty of fats, and then whatever carbohydrates we use, we want them to be like nice high in fiber to keep things slow and sustained over time. So, a really great example of something like this might be like a casein protein shake, maybe like a whole grain or whole wheat bagel, and with a little bit of peanut butter on top. Those are all like going to be really, really slow digesting sources. It's going to keep that all the nutrients just nice even keel throughout the night, and the athlete won't wake up feeling starving or deprived of food. So those are kind of the big ones that we want to hit. So again, depending on the personal preference and depending on kind of the timeline, we might try to choose foods that are a little bit more quickly digesting, or maybe a little bit more. We might favor liquids versus solids, and in other cases we might favor solids over liquids, slower digesting, a little more health promoting, etc. You should play around with this a little bit for yourself and for your athletes. Everybody's going to be a little bit different. Everybody's going to have some slightly different personal preferences in terms of like what sits well with them, what sates them really well, what is satisfying to them. Either way, but these are kind of the general trends that we want to see when we're trying to take our nutrient timing and food composition pairings throughout the day. I hope all that made sense. I hope the examples were at least helpful, and I hope you guys find some really good food options for yourself.